Okay, cool. So we're officially recording, which means I stop swearing. So welcome everyone again to the lockdown series. Thank you to the government for giving us a little minor lockdown yesterday. So 2021 is when we're all going to start getting back to seeing each other. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it's obviously gone further, but we've managed to keep this up, and the numbers have been really good, and the YouTube numbers have been really good as well. And again, obviously, topics, trying to keep it varied every month. So Stephen's got something he told us himself is very interesting. To big you up, Stephen, before you even start. And we're looking forward to it. I like the little first slide, as I said, so it'll be interesting. So Stephen will crack away for the next kind of 30, 40 minutes, so how long it takes him. Obviously, as per usual, there's always loads of questions. So if you have questions at all, the Q&A box at the bottom is very handy. If you want to ask something during it, you can get to it at the end. And if it's okay with Stephen, I'm sure we'll give 10 or 15 minutes at the end after he finishes up to ask any questions as well. So anything you think of during the talk, feel free to flag it out as well, and we'll give you a chance then. Obviously, shameless plug for myself. I started a new job yesterday, so we have a new sponsor. That means, because whoever I work ends up sponsoring this thing. So thanks a million to my new boss, Rob. I don't know if he's on the call, but just in case he is, I'm going to say thanks a million for being a great boss already after one day. And we'll get that going there. So Martin's and Myers, new place I'm working, so you can all see it in LinkedIn. So shameless plug over, and seamlessly straight into you, Stephen. Good luck.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for joining. I suppose give a brief introduction. My name is Stephen Meehan. I'm software tester, been testing for a long time. I'm currently working with Populo here in Cork. They do internal communications within companies. And I suppose the topic of today's talk is something that I've been very interested in over the last few years. It's a tool that's used for API testing, functional API testing. So in this talk, what I'm hoping to communicate to you guys is the usefulness of the tool, my experience with it, how to get started with it, and just generally in terms of API testing, where the Crafty DSL as a tool fits in. And as I was explaining to the organizers earlier, I unfortunately haven't had a chance to do a dry run with this. I did present it to my team about a month ago, and I meant to do a dry run for this actual session. So apologies if I go under or over by a bit, but I'm hoping for the best. The format is I'm going to go through the slides, go through Crafty DSL, and I will be jumping in and out to actually show a demo of Crafty DSL working in a couple of projects that I've created. So of course it's a demo, nothing can go wrong, right? We all know that. So without further ado then, I'll go on to the presentation, and as Patrick said, if you've got questions, please put them into the chat, and we should have time at the end to address that. So what is Crafty DSL? So this is from the Crafty DSL website. It's the only open source tool to combine API test automation with mocks, performance testing, and even UI automation into a single unified framework. The BDD syntax popularized by Cucumber is language neutral and easy for even non-programmers. It has powerful JSON and XML assertions built in, and you can run tests in parallel for speed. So there's a lot of functionality within Crafty DSL. I'm in this talk only going to really cover the API test automation part, but as you can see here, you can also do mocks, performance testing, and even UI automation. So I definitely encourage people who are interested, if it fits with what you want to accomplish, then definitely explore these other options. Based on my experience with the API test automation, I think you'll have a good experience. So for the purpose of this demo, I've used some publicly available APIs. So there's the Yelp Fusion project, which is a RESTful API. And then there's also a GraphQL implementation, and the links are here on the slides. And we'll be sharing these slides after this presentation. So maybe just to talk a little bit about, first steps before you test an API. Typically, what I do is I would familiarize myself with the documentation for the API. And then as a starting point, I use an API client. Personally, I like to use Postman. It's probably the most popular one out there. It's got tons of features. And I think it's a good way to get, an initial feel for what needs to be tested or how the API works. So I might just go into demo mode here and just explore a little bit on that. So for example, here's the Yelp Fusion API. Just to mention, if you want to use these APIs yourself, you can just sign up for their beta program and they'll give you a API key that you can use to test these APIs. But as a starting point, I would look at the documentation here. So you can see actually they make it very easy as well to test in Postman, because you can just import a collection into Postman by selecting this link here. But they've got the various functionalities within the API listed here. So you've got a business search where, and I'm sure a lot of people here will be familiar with Yelp. It's like an online system for finding like nearby businesses, typically restaurants, and you can post reviews, etc. So it's quite a popular application. So under business search, you can search for businesses by keyword, category, location, price level, etc. Then you've got phone search for businesses by phone number, transaction search for businesses which support food delivery transactions, etc., etc. So just to point out, that would be the first step I would do before even going into Crafty, would be read the documentation and be thinking about, what tests you would perform based on the functionality that's provided by their API. Also to point out, in this demo, I'm not going to do any negative testing. The only reason being, I'm concerned that if I do negative testing, they might actually revoke the API key. And I just, in general, if you're testing a publicly available API like this, just respect the API as such and respect the limits that are on the API. It's quite possible there'd be no problem doing negative testing, but I didn't want to risk it, especially in terms of a demo. I don't want the API key revoked for something that I'm doing to the APIs. So I'll just show you in Postman what that imported collection looks like, and maybe we could look at one or two tests run in Postman before we dive into the Crafty. So this one here is getting a business by an ID. So you've got your URL here, and then you've got like the ID, which actually can be in the form of a string here, like not an actual ID as you would typically think of it, but an actual descriptive ID as such. And then an important point is in the headers here, you're going to have your bearer token, which, as I said, you'll get when you sign up for their beta program. Because this is a GET, it doesn't have any body as such in the request itself. And you can just very simply test this out by clicking send, and Postman will show you the results here. So, I mean, straight off the bat, the first thing you would probably test for is that you get a 200 OK response. And then, as you can see here in the body, you may want to check, that this ID is correct. And now, in this case, we're using a hard-coded value. But as I'll show you later on, if you were dealing with a response that could have dynamic data, in other words, if this ID was changing from request to request, then you can't just expect that the ID is going to be a hard-coded value. You would need to really account for that by doing more intelligent types of verifications on the response. And I can show you how Crafty is very good at that. So that's really the first steps in terms of getting familiar with an API. And we'll move on now to the next part. So I'll just go back to the presentation here. So in terms of setting up Crafty then to use it, you can use Maven to create your project, which is, I think, really good. It's Maven, who, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's a project management tool, and it's based on the page object model, or the POM. And it's used for projects to build them and for their dependencies and documentation. And you can find this on Crafty's website, but to actually generate a Crafty project, it's as simple as passing in this onto the command line. So you just put in your group ID, the fact that it's Crafty archetype, the version that you want to use, and yeah, the name of the project, and it will generate the POM file, which I can show you later on. There's a couple of other dependencies that I included in my projects. So there's very good reporting by Masterthought. It's an additional library that you can import. So that's over here. You just add an extra dependency to your POM file for Masterthought and Surefire, and that gives really good reporting, which I'll be able to demonstrate as well further on. So some of the things to consider when you're setting up a project like this, you're probably going to have different environments that you want to run your tests in. So you may be testing it in your staging environment and your production environment, or you may have development, staging, production, but you will be testing more than likely against different hosts. And for each of those hosts, you probably have different authentication that you'll need to use. So how Crafty handle that is they've got this Crafty-config.js file, and it's very simply, you specify what values are passed in from the command line. So here we're assigning the host value to the host value that's sent from the command line, and similarly the API key. So we can, at command line time, tell Crafty what host we want to run and against, and the API key that we're using. So I can show you that in a real project in a few minutes. So just to show you then the structure of a Crafty test, and I think this is one of the real strengths of Crafty, is that even just by looking at this, you have, I feel, a very clear idea of what the test is doing. There's really no code needed to be written here. It's all using Gherkin, which is an English-like syntax, really. So up here, you've got your scenario. So this is an example from their Crafty website, create and retrieve a cat. So you're saying what URL that you're hitting, and then your request, which in this case, you want to get the cat named Billy. So something to point out is that JSON is native to the syntax. So you can just put in the JSON here without having to put like quotation marks around name, for example. You know, it just accepts the JSON. It's native to the syntax. So it makes it very easy to work with JSON in requests and in responses as well, actually, to interrogate the response. Then the next thing is you say you want to post that request, and you want to get a status of 201, which means that this cat was created. So apologies, I may have said retrieve the cat called Billy, but it's actually you're creating a cat called Billy. And then here, where you're matching on the response, you're saying that you expect an ID to come back with the name Billy. And this is one of the things I referenced earlier, is where there's powerful matching assertions in Crafty. So as I was saying, the ID is something that might be a dynamic value. In most cases, it will be a dynamic value. So you can't put in a hard-coded ID here, but what you can say is you expect there to be ID, and it should be a not null value. So I think that's quite a powerful assertion to be able to do in your tests. And here's a second HTTP call using that response data. So from this response, you can take the ID, which is returned from this request, and now you can do another test and say, right, I'm going to get that ID of the cat that I just created, and it should have a status of 200. So I think it reads nicely, and it's actually very easy to get started with something like this. So I might just jump into one of the projects now and show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go to my projects here. So here's the autocomplete feature. So up here, I've got a description of the feature. Provides autocomplete suggestions for businesses, search keywords and categories, and we've got the reference there to the Yelp documentation. Up here, I've got a background step. So anything that is in the background will be run for every single test. So useful things to put up here are the URL that you're going to be hitting. So we're going to be passing in the host value from the command line, and then we're going to be hitting this autocomplete URL. And then obviously we need to have our API key in the authorization header as well. So in this case, it's going to be searching for text DEL. So this is an example on Yelp's own website. So you could be searching for delicatessens maybe in a certain area. So this is a latitude and longitude that's going to be passed in as parameter values. And then when we execute that request, we expect to get a 200 response. So just to look at it maybe in Postman before we run it in Crafty. So these are your parameters. DEL, that's your latitude, that's your longitude. And in this case, this is the response that came back. So I'll just verify that's still working, get a 200 response. So going back to my Crafty project, I mentioned that you've got this Crafty config.js. So this is going to take in my host value, my API key value, and it's going to use them here to determine what URL I'm hitting, and here to pass in the authorization header. And just to mention as well, there's a tagging feature in Crafty. So I just want to run this particular scenario for the demo. So I'm tagging this as @demo. I don't have that tag on the second test here, so it should just run this scenario. I don't have it on any other of my feature files here. So when I go to run it, it'll just run this scenario, and we can take a look at it. I like to actually structure my project as well in terms of how the API is organized. So you've got autocomplete, and then you've got businesses where you can search by an ID, you can get reviews by ID, you can search by phone number. So that's, I just think, helps to keep your tests organized, and I found that to be quite helpful. This is the test runner, so this is actually what runs the test for you. You must make sure that your class path is correct. So in this case, Yelp is the directory under Java. So basically anything that you've specified in here, it will look for it in the Java folder. So it'll find Yelp, and then it will run everything below that. But as I mentioned with the tagging feature, what this will do, you see the way I've got a tilde before the @ignore. That means that anything that I've tagged as @ignore it will not run them. That's what the tilde does. And then here I've got @demo, which means that it's not going to run anything unless it's got that tag on it, the @demo tag. And I'm using, I've taken this code basically from a demo project that is on the slides, and it's very good. It's written by the creator of Crafty DSL, who's his name is Peter Thomas, and he's very good in terms of responding on Stack Overflow. His documentation is excellent, and there's plenty of examples for you to follow up. And like I said, I was able to get this report working using his demo project. So I think I'll just run this particular feature now just to show you how it works. So it's a Maven project, so I'm doing Maven clean tests, and then I'm passing in the host that I want to run the test against. So in this case, api.yelp.com. So that's going to go into this value here. Then that's my API key as well, which I need to pass in. And if I hit enter, it should start to run that test. So it ran that test, and I'll show you the reporting side of this. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a master thought library. It's in here somewhere, yeah, master thought. And that will give us some really nice reporting. It's the one that Peter Thomas actually recommends to use. And you also need this Surefire plugin as well, or dependency, to make that work. So when you've got these dependencies and you use the test runner as it is set up here, what happens is it'll generate a target folder, and within that target folder there'll be this Cucumber HTML reports directory. So within that you can go to your overview features, is where I'd normally go to. If there's a failure, you can go straight to failures, but the features will give you a high level overview. So I'm just going to open that in my browser and show you what the report looks like. So we only ran one test. You can see here's the link to it. And what's nice about this report, you can see everything that you've set up. All your gherkin is here. But you can also see the requests that you sent. So if there's, for example, if this had failed and you needed to investigate what went wrong, by clicking on this document string here, you can see this is the request that was sent, and then this is the response. So it's actually really easy to see at a glance what the test did. So that's a basic example, but we'll get into a few more in-depth ones as we go through this. So as I said, there's some powerful matching assertions with Crafty. So it can match literal JSON, including nested JSON. It can ignore parts of the JSON. For example, if you've got timestamps or unique IDs that you want to ignore in the test, you can just do #ignore. And it can do fuzzy matching. For example, it can verify that the response conforms to the regex you specify. So this is the list of the matchers that are available. So there's lots of them here, like we already spoke about the ignore one, the null one if you expect the value to be null, if you expect it to be not null, even if you expect the value to be present. So if you know that like this particular key has to be present in the response, but you know, you can't, or you don't want to verify the values for that key, you can just use #present. The inverse of that, not present, if you do not expect it to be present at all. If you're expecting an array, a JSON object, a Boolean, a number, a string, a unique ID as well, which can be very handy. And then regex, which is extremely powerful because, you know, it's a great way to assert on something that can be difficult using these other markers as such. Like regex is a very powerful way to match unexpected strings. You can also use Java expressions. There's advanced array validation, and you know, you can have these other expressions as well. So I would have only touched on like some of these, particularly these, the regex and the expressions. I haven't even scratched the surface in terms of what they can do, but from my experience, for what I need to verify in a response, I've always been able to find it in the Crafty tool set. So I might just demo how that works. So I've got another test just below the previous one. And remember when I showed you this in Postman, we got an array categories back, or an array called categories. We got a businesses array, which is empty. And then we've got a terms array, which has some values in it. So as I mentioned, this data is dynamic. So it depends on the term that you're putting in. So, you know, if you put in something like that, you're not going to get any values at all in any of these categories. And that's a valid response. So in this case, you may say, right, what I really want to verify is that an array is returned for categories, an array is returned for businesses, an array is returned for terms, but I'm not sure that there's going to be any values in any of those arrays, but I do know that I should be returned an array, even if it's an empty array. So in Crafty, that's very easily accomplished by just using the hash array matcher here. So I'll just put the demo tag on this and run it. And we should see this passing as well. Okay, so that has passed. So in addition to verifying that we got a 200 response, we've also now verified that the body contains what we expect. So another thing maybe to mention that I found useful is that there are times when you might want to test multiple scenarios for the same API request. So we can use scenario outlines for this with an example table that will inject the specified values into the request. So you'll have one request for each row in the table. So I'll just demo that now. So if we go to our search here. So within search, this is a scenario outline here. So the way this works is that I'm passing in the term value that I want to search for. I'm passing in the latitude and the longitude, and then I'm calling get on this, and I'm matching this response where I want an array of businesses. I want a total number. So here I'm using the number matcher. And then I want this region JSON object, which will have longitude and latitude, which should be the same as the longitude and latitude that has been passed into the request. So this is the table that I've defined down here then. So these are the terms. So Del for deli, Chinese for Chinese restaurant, and then the latitude and longitude values here. And then just for reference, I've gotten these latitude and longitudes for Dublin, one for Cork. So that's just to know it's not actually used in the test, but it's just for documentation purposes to know what areas this test is looking for. So I'm going to just put in the demo here again to make sure this gets run. And again, I'll run my command. So these tests passed, and if I go to the report here, So what you can see is you've actually gotten 2 tests here instead of just 1. So in the first case, it searched for DEL for those latitude and longitude values. And then in the second test, the second scenario as such, it has searched for term Chinese, and it's used that longitude and latitude values, latitude, longitude. So scenario outlines can be very powerful in terms of if you want to really intensively test an API with lots of different parameters and different values for each row, you can do that very easily, and it'll iterate over that. So that's a nice feature as well. So another thing to consider maybe is that you could have a service that you're calling multiple times, and you don't want to be duplicating those calls multiple times in your feature file. So what you can do there is you can have that service as such in its own feature file, and then you can call that service from other feature files. So also that feature file can accept arguments, giving you greater flexibility in how you test it. So I'll just demo that now. So here we're reusing one of our feature files. So I'm specifying the class path to the service that I want to call. So I've got a reuse package here. And in that package, I've got getBusinessID.feature, and I'm passing in these values into it. So I'm looking for Italian in this latitude and longitude. And if we actually look at how that's defined, we've got, again, our background up here, and we've got the parameters, which is going to be the term that's passed into the test, and the latitude and longitude. So it's going to pick these up from the calling test as such. So these values are going to be passed in, and then it's going to get the ID from that response. So it returns an array, and then you get the first item from that array. So that's how you do that, is you have the 0 element of the array here for the businesses array, and then you get the ID from that. And what we're doing then is we're actually using that ID to call the get method on this URL up here. So it's going to get that particular ID and expect a status code of 200. So again, I should be able to run that by tagging it. And if we just look at that in the report, so this is where it called out to the feature file with the reusable service. You can look at what that requests. That was the string that was passed, or the JSON object that was passed to it. Then this is where it actually the called test as such. This is the values it used. So if we look in here, we can actually see the values. So the term was Italian, the latitude was that, the longitude was that, and we can see this is the response that it gave back, this array of business IDs. Well, not just IDs, but an array of businesses as such. These are our JSON objects in here. So it's expecting a status of 200, which it did get. So it's past that, and then it's calling our get businesses by ID endpoint now, and you can see what that looks like. So it's extracted that business ID here, and it's using it in this test, and it's saying, right, call this endpoint with that ID, and again, it's verifying that we get a 200 response. And as you can see there, it gave us, you know, a good response in return. Yeah, just to mention also that it's not just for REST APIs, which is what we've been looking at, but there's also support for GraphQL, which is gaining in popularity hugely. Like all of the APIs that I've worked on since I joined my current company here have all been GraphQL APIs. So it's definitely the modern approach to building APIs. So I have another project where I can show you an example of testing a GraphQL endpoint. The difference really is that you just specify a query at first. So this is your query in JSON format, and yeah, that's, you have this request step then, which is going to, it'll take that query and plug it into the request essentially. So I'll just show that that's in a different project. So here we have query for a business by ID. So this is the query, and it gets plugged into the request here. It's going to expect a 200 response, or yeah, 200 status code response, and it's going to match the response. In this case, it's going to literally match the response. So because this information should really be consistent every time, because you're calling a particular business ID, there's no matchers as such in this. It's expecting this literal response. So I just must check what the test runner, yeah, the test runner is going to run anything that's tagged with business. So, and this has the business tag. So I should be able to run this and see. Okay, so that failed, which I wasn't expecting. As I said, demos always work. So let's just have a look and see. So here it didn't like this particular query. Oh yes, so actually, as I mentioned, I'm using Yelp's APIs, and these are rate limited. So you can see here the response I got back. You've exceeded the queries per second limit for this endpoint. Try reducing the rate at which you make queries. So this is expected behavior as such, because I've just called these endpoints too many times. So I've exceeded that rate limit. So that's all needs to be said about that, I think. Yeah, so it actually ran 2 tests as well here. So this is where it's searching for burritos in Cork. It's a popular search for me. So here it's search term burrito location Cork, and then in the response that we're expecting back, we want a number and a business array. And as I was saying earlier, the number, the total, it could be 25, it could be 0, but this will cover us in all cases. And similarly, the array could be an array of 25 businesses, or it could be an empty array. And again, that will cover us. And there's also an example here where it's using this scenario outline. So it's using this examples table here to use different values for what it's actually matching against. So in this case, it's expecting an alias key, which should have a response type of string, a URL, which would be string, is claimed as Boolean, and rating of a number. So you can actually use the scenario outlines to validate values in the response, as well as vary the values that are used in the request itself. Just to highlight the fact that API testing is a huge area, and I definitely would not class myself as an API testing expert. I think I'm really scratching the surface of the area involved in API testing as a whole. So I have a link here to, I think, a really great article by Cindy Sridharan. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. But I would recommend people to read this article. I've just taken one image from it. It covers all the types of testing that you can do in both pre-production and in production. So honestly, some of these I wouldn't even begin to talk about them, because I feel like they're areas outside my expertise. I know that, like, mutation testing, for example, is, you know, bombarding the API with lots of different values to see, does the API respond in a different way. Actually, just saying that now, I think that might be more fuzz testing. I can't remember off the top of my head mutation testing. Yeah, I'm sure I researched that before, but I just can't think off the top of my head exactly how to describe it. But contract testing is making sure that you don't break your contract as an API. So there could be other teams depending on your APIs, and you can define the contract for your API, you know, how you expect the API to behave. And if you break that contract, your contract tests will flag that straight away. Unit tests we're all familiar with. Functional tests would be where Crafty comes into play. You've got component tests, integration tests, fuzz testing, which I mentioned. You've also got load testing, which I know that Crafty has the ability. You can use Gatling, a performance testing tool, with Crafty, which I haven't personally used, but I think it's potentially a really powerful tool to use with Crafty, because you'd be covering your load testing and your functional testing with one framework potentially. So I think that could be really worth exploring. Smoke testing, I think we're all familiar with. Coverage tests, regression tests, acceptance tests, property-based tests, which is another important area that again, I would have done some research on in the past, but I won't risk saying anything about it, because I probably will misstate something about that. But I know it's one of those hot areas. Usability testing. So, you know, I think a great thing to do actually is to always do exploratory testing. You know, so particularly in these examples that I've shown, it's very much been happy path, and I haven't done any negative scenarios. But just recently, another context within our company did like a mob testing session using Postman on one of their APIs, and it was great because you had multiple people testing at the same time, really looking to break the API and find usability and other issues with it. So I definitely recommend doing exploratory testing. You know, I think it's really important. Benchmarking, stress tests, config tests, and then in production you've got canarying. Monitoring, I think, is critical, you know, so monitoring the health of your API while it's in production. Exploration, I already touched on. Profiling, distributed tracing, dynamic instrumentation. Chaos engineering, that's a really interesting one. I think Netflix do a lot of this, where they'd be bringing services down and seeing how the system reacts. And, you know, I think there's there's huge potential there to really, make sure the system is very robust by doing some chaos engineering, feature flagging, real user monitoring, user engagement tests, A/B testing. That can be very helpful to know, how the API is actually being used by your customers, and traffic shifting. So I'd encourage people. It's a long time actually since I looked at this article. The link is in the slides, and I'm sure we'll be sharing the slides afterwards. But just I wanted to emphasize that, what I'm showing here is just scratching the surface in terms of what's involved in API testing. But I hope it's been useful for people, and that, in terms of functional and smoke testing, that what I've shown today should be helpful for people who want to get a start, who are considering using Crafty. So these are the resources. This is the Crafty page. This is the Crafty demo that Peter Thomas, his project, which is really excellent. There's tons of examples in there. And then I've just put links to my GitHub projects. So these two projects that I've demoed here today are available on my GitHub page if you want to take a look. And you just need to sign up for your API keys with Yelp if you want to run these. So yeah, thanks everybody for your attendance, and I'll hand it over to Patrick for questions.
Cheers. Thanks, Stephen. That was great. A lot of information there. As you said, if it's okay with yourself, I might share maybe some of the details tomorrow, any kind of the recommended reading or any slides on that tomorrow. We
Sure.
can share them with all the members tomorrow. I'll stick out an email to everyone who attended this evening and share them out if anyone wants to do it. And of course, there'll be a recording of the talk up online as well. So anyone that feels that any of their colleagues or mates that missed the talk this evening would benefit from it, you can be able to share that with them as well. So we'll crack through any questions you have. So again, any questions you have, just stick them in the Q&A box. I'm going to just call them out just so they'll get caught in the recording. Manjeet Khalsa, hey Manjeet. Manjeet actually asked this about 20 minutes ago, so I'm not sure it was in relation to the end of it or during the start, but he just asked, could you use JavaScript?
Yes, it does support the use of JavaScript, and it's something that I've really only touched on a little bit, but it does support JavaScript, and I think that's definitely would be, there's some very powerful things you can do with JavaScript. I'm not a JavaScript expert, and I just, had to look on Stack Overflow and things like that to figure out how to use it for my particular problem. But it's a great point. It's a great question, and it's great that it supports JavaScript. So yeah.
Okay, cool. We have a question from our pal Carol, all the way over in Austin, Texas. So Carol's asked, how are the burritos in Ireland? Probably not as good as Texas. I can answer for that.
Definitely not as good as Texas, I'd say. Yeah.
I think the second part, Steve, might be more your bag than mine. Have you experienced any authentication and unique token challenges with GraphQL?
Yes. So like what I've shown there with Yelp, it was very straightforward. You get the XAPI key, and authentication is very simple. So I've definitely, on my real live work projects, I'd say the biggest pain point has definitely been authentication. So we use AWS, and it involves signing requests, and authentication is very complex and very difficult to do. Even using a tool like Postman, at least for the project that we have, it's anything but straightforward to get authentication working. So what I actually ended up doing, I had to get a lot of development help, and that's kind of a takeaway that I would give to anybody listening, is that, when you can get help from developers, definitely use it. It's been great for me to get their help. But what they ended up doing was actually writing a Lambda that I could call from Crafty to do the authentication part for me. So then I could continue on after that. So yeah, definitely it's actually been the biggest pain point, was authentication on my real world project.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the question, Karen. I hope you're well, pal. Declan Connolly. So Declan's asked, do you use Crafty DSL on its own, or do you integrate it with other test tools?
Currently, I'm just using it on its own completely, but it does work with, and I definitely encourage people to look on the Crafty site, because it's not just Gatling that it integrates with, but I'm sure from memory it integrates with other tools. You know, it's I could definitely see huge benefit to integrating with Gatling. It's just we don't use Gatling for performance testing on our team, so I haven't leveraged it in that way. So yeah, it's just purely Karate on its own that we've been using. We do integrate it into our pipeline, so we use GitLab for our CI/CD, and it's very easy to integrate into your CI/CD pipeline. You just run that command line, and actually you can disguise, like mark as secret the X API key, for example. So any sensitive data, I'd definitely encourage in your real world projects, to not to have those values hard coded anywhere in your project. Pass them in from the from your CI/CD system, and that works really well for us.
Okay, cool. Manji's just followed up as well. He asked with the JavaScript a second ago. He's just asked CI/CD Jenkins how to do using Crafty.
Yeah, I haven't used it for Jenkins, but I from what I've read, it's really, in fact, Jenkins is probably the first CI/CD I'd imagine that it was proved out with. So I really would say there'd be no problems in terms of integrating it there. I think it should be fine.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Manji. Hayden has asked, you like this one? Is there anything that it can't do that you've come across? I just had a quick look at Crafty, and it seems it just does about everything. And Hayden obviously works for Crafty as well, so.
Yeah, I genuinely would have to say that I don't I haven't come across a scenario that I haven't been able to test using Karate, and I'd have to give a lot of kudos to Peter Thomas, the guy who wrote it, because if you go on to Stack Overflow, 9 times out of 10 he's the guy who's answered the question. He's very responsive. His documentation is really good. The only thing that I really struggled with, like I mentioned before, was the authentication, and I couldn't really fault Karate for that. Like Postman was the same. I think it's to do with the setup that we have for our particular product. The fact that it's using AWS in the way that it's using it, it was just going to be very difficult regardless of what framework I used.
Cool. Yeah, Hayden just followed up with that by saying I wrote my own Java-based API framework and then found out about Crafty, so it seems to cover much of what I hand coded. So back in time, cool. Future reference anyway. Question from Rob's after asking: is the current market for API testers growing, in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, I just think APIs are all pervasive now. Like I've been in the industry a long time, and in the last 10 years, it's just been growing exponentially, really, that I've been involved in API testing, and just if you look out to see where APIs are being used and how much API development is taking place, it's just everywhere. Like we're moving to microservice, or have been moving to microservice architecture. That's the standard. APIs are everywhere. People, their code needs to be somebody else needs to be able to use the code that's written, and the APIs are the means of achieving that, so, or at least one of the means. So yes, I would say I can't see the demand for API dev and testing going away. If anything, I just see it increasing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'd second that as well. The last year or two, we've seen a lot more demand. It's becoming more and more common, and it's just being asked regularly. So I think it touches on what you just said there. There's a couple more questions to finish up. I know you're probably still in the office. We leave you go home soon, but seems to be a good interest. Good. So question here is: can you create complex end-to-end use cases by combining multiple APIs? And does Crafty help with that, or is it a burden?
You can definitely create multiple complex end-to-end scenarios. So like the example that I showed there, where you're reusing a feature file, and then you can extract the whatever piece of information you need from the response for that feature file and use it in another feature file. So it's quite easy to actually chain requests together. So you can really run very complex scenarios, I think quite easily using Crafty, in my experience.
Okay, cool. And Carl just asked one more question there. Is just to remind us, what was the recommended test reporting library?
Masterthought.
Okay, Masterthought. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Grant. So pretty much, I think maybe one more question. I think that's most of them. Grant. So plenty of questions, always a good sign anyway. If there's no questions, Steve, it's usually a worry, but there's plenty there. So plenty more to say. So we'll probably leave it there. That's okay. So thanks a million for the talk. It was brilliant. You can see the amount of questions there. There's a lot of interest in it, which is good. And I think some people have obviously we've flagged already. They've taken something away from that, or maybe saved time in the future as well, which is great. So if it's okay yourself, I'll tag you up on LinkedIn tomorrow and put it out to everyone on the mailing list tomorrow morning. If that's okay, Stephen.
That's fine.
I'll get the recordings on that. And Stephen will have it up on YouTube tomorrow. So as I said, there's probably plenty of people here now watching this, and they have colleagues and mates in that at work or outside of work who would be interested in this as well. So feel free to share it with them if there's someone there that you think is good for it. We'll be back in a few weeks' time, probably at the end of the month, actually a bank holiday, Halloween. So we'll just probably the first week in November. The next presenter hasn't actually confirmed yet, but I can see his name on the attendee list tonight, so he is confirmed officially. So if you're there, you know who you are. So I'll be ringing you tomorrow to book you in for the first week in November after dodging me for
That's good to hear.
Yeah, he's there. I can see your name. So you have no excuse whatsoever anymore. Now you can't say you're busy because you're here tonight. So we'll give you a good talk.
Just on the subject of speakers, if as usual anyone wants to speak or anyone knows anyone that think that might be good, give myself or Paddy a shout, and we'll sort it all out.
Yeah, so we have.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
We have one or two more just before the end of the year anyway. So we have obviously in October and November, and we're going to try and get a few more in. Obviously, we're all to be in lockdown, so we'll try and do as much as we can before we hit December, and what's usually a crazy season, but it won't be this year. So that's pretty much the lot. So the recording will be out tomorrow. Everyone, thanks for attending as ever. Numbers keep it going. Input keeps it going. Obviously, again, even if you don't want to talk, if there's talks you want to hear about, or if there's topics that are relevant to you or what you're doing in your own place or what you're trying to learn, and it's something you actually want to hear about, feel free to give Darren and me a message as well, and we'll go and find a speaker. As you can see, the last few months, we're not just restricted, obviously, with having people in Dublin. We have Stephen from Cork tonight. We had Cara from Austin before. We have people from the UK. We can go and get people from outside of Dublin and further afield as well at the moment while we're doing the lockdown series. It does give us a bigger pool and lets us get the caliber of people like Stephen in without having to get to drive to Dublin for 3 or 4 hours. And people in Cork, as him and Connor and Rob and everyone else will tell you, they generally don't like leaving Cork anyway. So
very true.
That's pretty much it. Okay, cool. Thanks a million, Steve. Really appreciate your time.
Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks,
care.
everyone.